Quick spoiler warning, this video contains content from seasons 1 through 4 of Invincible, so if you're not caught up, you've been warned. The cruelest part about being was never the fighting. It wasn't the broken bones, the blood, or the constant pain. It was responsibility. Because no matter how powerful Mark Grayson became, people still died. Cities fell apart. Families still got destroyed. And every single time it happened, the world looked at Mark like it was somehow his fault. That's what makes Invincible different from almost every other superhero story. Most heroes get stronger and gain control. But for Mark, the stronger he became, the heavier everything got. And over 4 seasons, we've watched that pressure slowly crush almost every part of his life. Because being invincible was never about becoming unstoppable. It was about surviving a responsibility no normal person was ever meant to carry. At the beginning of the series, Mark sees his powers as freedom. He's excited, carefree, almost innocent. For his entire life, he grew up idolizing heroes, especially his father, Omni-Man. To Mark, superheroes represented certainty. Good guys saved people, and the bad guys lost. If you were strong enough, you could always protect the people you cared about. That's why getting powers feels like the beginning of his real life, not a burden, a dream. And that optimism is important, because Invincible spends the rest of the story systematically destroying it. The moment that changes Mark forever isn't just his father betraying Earth. It's what Nolan forces him to realize about power itself. During their fight in Chicago, Mark is finally exposed to the reality of what overwhelming power actually looks like, and it's horrifying. He isn't watching civilians die from a distance. He's trapped inside the destruction, held against a subway while innocent people are torn apart in front of him, completely powerless to stop it. That scene breaks Mark's understanding of heroism, because for the first time, he realizes strength doesn't just automatically create safety. Sometimes power just creates bigger disasters. And the worst part is, Mark survives, which means he has to keep living with the memories of everyone who didn't. That trauma becomes the foundation for almost every decision he makes afterward. Because from that point forward, Mark becomes terrified of failing people the same way Nolan failed him. After Nolan leaves Earth, something changes. The world stops seeing Mark as a teenager trying to become a hero, and starts seeing him as a necessity. Cecil relies on him constantly because there are few people strong enough to handle the threats Earth faces. The Guardians need him, his family needs him, the planet needs him. And Mark slowly realizes something terrifying. Once people know you can save them, failure stops feeling accidental. Every mistake starts feeling personal. That pressure completely consumes his normal life. College becomes impossible. Relationships fall apart. He's constantly exhausted. And even when he tries to rest, another catastrophe appears. One of the smartest things Invincible does is show that Mark never actually gets time to process trauma before another disaster hits. He just keeps moving. And every season makes that cycle worse. If Nolan shattered Mark's innocence, then the Invincible War shattered his identity. Because for the first time in the story, Mark isn't fighting the Flaxens or the bloodthirsty battle beast. He's fighting himself. And what makes the Invincible War so horrifying isn't just the destruction. It's what the alternate Marks reveal about him. Every version of Invincible during the war represents a path Mark could have taken. A version that embraced Viltrumite ideology. A version that stopped valuing human life. A version that gave up emotionally. And some of them are pretty terrifying. One variant casually destroys entire cities with almost no emotion. Another openly mocks Earth's heroes because he sees humanity as weak. Some versions work directly under Viltrumite rule. Others conquer planets themselves. And the scariest part is that all of them still sound like Mark. They still have pieces of his personality, his confidence, and his memories, which means Mark is forced to confront something horrifying. The difference between him and these monsters might not be power, it might be choice. That's why the Invincible War affects him so deeply. Because after seeing 16 evil versions of himself, he can't pretend becoming Omni-Man is impossible anymore. The potential already exists inside him, and during the chaos of the war, thousands die, heroes fall, entire cities collapse. And even though the destruction was caused by alternate Invincibles, Earth still associates the devastation with Mark's image. His symbol becomes connected to fear. That changes him permanently, because from this point forward, Mark stops asking whether he's strong enough to save everyone, and starts asking whether he's strong enough to stay himself. Conquest is one of the most important villains in Invincible, because he forces Mark to abandon the illusion that every conflict can end peacefully. Until this point, Mark still desperately wants to believe heroism and morality are enough. Conquest destroys that belief. Everything about him represents pure Viltrumite philosophy, strength, domination, violence. But unlike Omni-Man, Conquest genuinely enjoys it, and that makes him terrifying. Throughout the fight, Mark is completely overwhelmed. Broken bones, collapsed organs, constant exhaustion. But what truly changes him is realizing that Conquest will never stop. There's no negotiation, no empathy, no hidden humanity, only destruction. And when the people Mark loves are put directly in danger, something inside him finally snaps. For one of the first times in the story, Mark stops fighting like a hero trying to survive, and starts fighting like someone willing to kill. That shift matters, because after Conquest, Mark becomes more aggressive, more pragmatic, more emotionally scarred. The burden of responsibility has finally started reshaping him psychologically. And when Conquest eventually returns, the rematch becomes one of the biggest turning points in Mark's entire life. Because this time, Mark isn't the same person. The fear is gone. Instead, there's rage. During their final battle, Mark fights with a level of brutality we rarely see from him earlier in the series. Not because he enjoys violence, but because he understands the consequences of hesitation now. He knows what happens if Conquest survives. He already put the people he loves at risk once. He wasn't going to let it happen again. And the terrifying part is that Mark wins specifically because he's becoming more willing to embrace the harsher realities of his world. That's the tragedy of Conquest. He doesn't just physically wound Mark. He accelerates the transformation Mark spent his entire life trying to avoid. The most important conflict in Invincible isn't Earth versus the Viltrumites. It's Mark versus Inheritance. Every season asks the same question. Can Mark stay human while controlling power designed for domination? The violence affects him differently now. He becomes more aggressive, more pragmatic, more emotionally isolated. And honestly, that fear makes complete sense, because Mark's life constantly teaches him the same lesson. Mercy, hesitation, and weakness all have consequences. That tension is what makes him such a compelling protagonist. He wants to stay compassionate, but the universe keeps rewarding ruthlessness. By this point in the story, Mark barely feels like a normal person anymore. He becomes a symbol, a soldier, a protector, a weapon against extinction-level threats. And the tragedy is that everyone around him slowly begins treating him that way too. The Coalition needs him for the war against Viltrum. Earth depends on him constantly. His family depends on him emotionally. There's never room for him to simply exist as Mark anymore. Even his relationships become shaped by responsibility. His relationship with Eve is constantly interrupted by violence and duty. And what makes their dynamic so important is that Eve is one of the only people who actually understands how emotionally exhausted Mark is becoming. Around everyone else, he has to act invincible. Around Eve, he's allowed to break. But even then, he never fully escapes the pressure. His relationship with Debbie changes after Omni-Man's betrayal. Because now Mark isn't just her son anymore. He's also a reminder of Nolan. And Oliver creates another kind of fear entirely. For Mark, Oliver represents the possibility that another Viltrumite could lose their humanity the same way Nolan almost did. That's why he's so protective over him. Not just physically, morally. He wants Oliver to grow up differently. Because deep down, Mark is still trying to prove that power doesn't automatically create monsters. But the more responsibility he takes on, the more isolated he becomes. Mark spends so much time trying to save everyone else that eventually there's almost nothing left of himself. And that isolation becomes one of the saddest parts of his character. Because despite being surrounded by people, Mark is emotionally carrying burdens almost nobody around him can fully understand. Thank you guys so much for watching, and if you enjoyed, please like, comment, and subscribe, and suggest new characters you want to see in future videos. Peace.